Hey guys, welcome to another video for anatomy and physiology. And in this video I'm going to be highlighting the urinary system. This is an introductory video to that urinary system, so I'll be specifically talking about the kidneys and their functions and different parts of the kidneys. Okay, so again, this is just an introduction, so we're going to be highlighting the anatomy, the location of the kidneys, and some of the functions. So the urinary system consists of two kidneys. As you can see here, you have a right kidney and a left kidney. Let me center that. Okay, so you have a right kidney, and then you have a left kidney. All right. Okay, so the primary function of the kidneys is to filter blood. Okay, and it filters blood into what's called the ureters right here. It's these long tubes. And these long tubes go down and filter. They drain urine, which has waste product. They filter that urine into what's called the bladder, which is right behind your pelvic, your pubis bone in your pelvic area. Okay, so here is your urinary bladder. Now, what's behind the urinary bladder? So this is the female. Okay, this is the female anatomy, because what's behind the urinary bladder is actually the uterus. Okay, and as you can see, it's right behind and on top. Okay, it's right behind the bladder. So as you can imagine, when a woman has a baby and the baby's in the uterus and growing, that it can press down on that bladder quite a bit, and it does reduce the amount of volume that a female can carry throughout the pregnancy. Okay, so as I mentioned, you have two kidneys. Let me back up here a little bit. Let's go back to the kidneys. Actually, before I go into the talk about the kidneys. Just looking at the kidneys, I want to highlight the circulatory system. You have the venous and the arterial system. So I have highlighted all the veins and arteries. Of course, I don't have all the other tiny little capillaries that go into every little muscle and skin cell. But these are the main arteries and veins that are in the body. And so your blood, or your kidneys, they actually filter about 150 liters a day. Okay, so if you have about 5 liters in the human body, and it's filtering out 150 liters in a day, your entire circulatory system, your entire urinary system, renal system, your kidneys filter your blood about 30 times a day. All right, so it's really important to be well hydrated. And so here I'm highlighting now urination structures: your kidneys, ureters, your bladder, and then your urethra. Right down here where the urine is, where the urine exits the body. Okay, so let's continue with the kidneys again. All right, so as I said, you have a right and the left kidney. All right, and the kidneys, they are protected partially by your floating ribs. Okay, so your 12th rib and your 11th rib, and also your spine, and the anterior portion, they are protected by your abs and your internal organs. So here are your kidneys. Okay, so now the kidneys on the back sit right below the T12 vertebrae. T meaning the thoracic vertebrae. So you have 12 thoracic vertebrae, and this is the last one. And right after that 12 vertebrae, you have 5 lumbar vertebrae. Okay, 4, 5. So your kidneys sit right below the T12, the last thoracic vertebrae, and just above the L3 vertebrae, which L represents the lumbar, the third lumbar vertebrae. Let me bring this up, and let's go in a little bit. So this is your L3, this is your L4, and then here's your L5. Okay, so there's your L3, right above the L3, and just below the T12 vertebrae. And so as I mentioned before, it's also protected anteriorly by your peritoneum. Okay, the peritoneum is it's essentially fibrous tissue that kind of cushions your internal organs in the front. You have your stomach, and as you can see here, your liver, your pancreas, and other vital organs. So it's called retroperitoneally. Retro meaning behind, kind of, think retro, like retro music, movie music from the back, back in the day. So it says retro behind the peritoneum. Okay. Now you'll notice if you're paying close attention to the structure of your or the position of your kidneys, you have one kidney that's slightly above the other. Okay. So your right kidney sits just a little bit lower than your left kidney, and the reason behind that is because of your liver. So your right kidney sits. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. So your right kidney sits just below that liver, and the liver kind of pushes it down slightly, giving it just a lower orientation to that of the left kidney. Not really a big deal, but it's just something to notice. Maybe that'll be like an extra credit question on a quiz or something. Okay. So now that we've kind of discussed the kidneys, the general location of the kidneys, just real quick before we move on, the kidney is about the size of a fist or a bar of soap. It's about 12 centimeters long. And so what happened here is that we got the kidney and we cut it in half. Okay, we cut the kidney in half, and now we're going to go from the outside and work our way in. So the outermost, or one of the outermost layers, is the renal cortex. Okay, so that's the renal cortex. This is the outside layer of the kidney, and this is where a lot of the filtration actually occurs. Because if I zoom in really carefully, now it's not going to go into too many details. There's other images that I'll show you that go into the details, but there's a lot going on in this area of the kidney here. The filtration of the blood occurs right in this area. Okay, so let's zoom out a little bit. So that's the renal cortex, right? And let's work our way in. You see those little pyramids there? These are the renal pyramids. Okay, so you have about 8 to 12. Okay, 8 to 12 or 6 to 12 renal pyramids. Okay, and then you have the renal pelvises. Now, so this is the spine. All right. So medially to each of these kidneys. Okay, medially meaning towards the middle. Okay, so this is the area that's towards the middle. Now I actually need to change our image there. Okay, so I added a few more things you'll notice from the previous image. So this is the medial aspect of the kidney. The lateral aspect is the smoother part where there's nothing really coming out of there. But medially, the medial aspect of the kidney, you'll notice that there's some pretty large vessels going through. Now there's some that aren't actually shown here. So you have the arterial vessels, you have the venous, and then you also have the renal pelvis. Okay. Now what's not shown here is the lymphatic vessels and also the nervous tissue, the renal artery. Now, actually, I'll get to this, what I'm highlighting here in a second. I want to make sure I kind of stay in order. So going back to your vessels. So for example, this is the arterial vessel. So this is the blood that is coming from your heart, right? So this is the aortic, this is the abdominal aorta, and then here's your renal artery. And you'll notice that as we kind of zoom in, that renal artery starts to branch off. It becomes segmented, right? So it becomes segmented, and I'm actually kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit. Let me just highlight the portion of the kidney. So this portion of the kidney, you'll notice between each of these renal pyramids that there's somewhat of a column space in between all of them, right? And that's called the renal column in between that. Now, each of these renal columns does house, as you notice, some of the arterial and some of the venous circulatory system that goes through there. So going back to the renal pyramids, there's two sections that I want to highlight in the renal pyramids. Okay, so you have first your broad face. Okay, so the broad face of the renal pyramid is facing the renal cortex, right? So that's the broad face, the wider part. And then you'll notice that it kind of pyramids it to a point. Okay, not exactly a sharp point like a pyramid per se, but it begins to kind of narrow down. As it narrows down, this area right here is called the renal papillae. And so as I was mentioning earlier, in this area here, by the cortex and the broader aspect of the renal pyramid, the renal medulla, and this broader aspect, this is where a lot of the filtration is happening. And as it filters the waste product, okay, the rest of the blood goes through the venous system, but the waste product comes down, filters down into the renal papillae, the narrow aspect, and it narrows and it filters and it collects down into the minor calyces right here. The minor calyces then kind of gather together into the major calyces, and then basically into the renal pelvis, and then down the ureter into the bladder. So this entire area that I have highlighted here, okay, this is called the renal pelvis. So in this renal pelvis, it's subdivided into major and minor, what we call calyces. So your minor calyces are these areas right here. They're minor. Okay, this is actually the location of where a lot of the of your waste product will, your urine will begin to collect, and this actually is also the location of where your kidney stones will begin to form. So kidney stone is basically like a calcified rock that slowly begins to collect calcium ions. And these calcium ions, as they continue to collect over time, they become really sharp salt crystals, if you will. And those crystals, as they get bigger, eventually they get passed on through your ureter, and it's incredibly painful, as you can imagine. As you can imagine, a sharp rock going down this entire tube, and as it's coming down that tube, that sharp rock is just cutting up tissue, and it's I can only imagine how painful it is. And then it gets to the bladder, and then it has to go through the urethra. I cannot imagine. But I understand that it's very painful. And this is the location, the minor calyces, that where that begins to form. And from the minor calyces, okay, it begins to kind of segment into a major one called the major calyces. Okay, and then this major calyces eventually goes down the ureter, or forms the ureter, as where the urine is expelled from the body. Okay, so let's see, where else do we need to go into? So this is the renal cortex. These are the renal pyramids, or also referred to as the renal medulla. Okay, so this houses tubes that lead into the papillae. Okay, which the papillae is essentially, let me find that spot for you. The papillae is essentially these areas right here. Okay, this is the area of the papillae. This is where, again, as I mentioned before, where your urine will begin to collect over time before it goes into your ureter. Okay, so some of the functions of the urinary system. Actually, here, let me before I go into that. So this is a more detailed view of the arterial system and venous system inside of the kidney. So again, here's a renal artery, and then it segments to segmental renal artery, and then that further segments into the renal columns, if you remember those, called the interlobular arteries. And then as this artery takes a 90-degree turn, and you see they take a 90-degree turn at every renal pyramid, right? At this point, this is what you call the arcuate artery. So this 90-degree turn is the point at which you go from an interlobular to an arcuate artery. Okay, and that arcuate artery continues, and it becomes the efferent arteriole, which goes into what's called the glomerulus. And at this point right here, the glomerulus, this capsule here, okay, this Bowman's capsule, as it's also called, which we will address this particular portion of the kidney in greater detail later on. But all you really need to know right now is that all the blood in your body eventually finds its way through this process. Okay, it becomes the, I'm sorry, I said earlier the efferent, I meant to say afferent. Okay, so your arcuate vessels will then turn into the afferent, A with an A, not an E, afferent arteriole. And then in this capsule, in this glomerulus, this is where a lot of the filtration will occur. So the waste product that your blood is carrying, okay, will come in here and will filter out. All right, it'll filter out, and the blood will continue, and it will continue into what's called the efferent arteriole, and then it essentially goes backwards from what I just mentioned. So it goes from efferent to the arcuate into the arcuate vein, okay, and then it goes into the interlobular vein, and then it leads out the segmented vein, and then eventually out the renal vein, and then back into the heart, and then to the lungs, and what have you. Okay, so that was just a great, a bigger, a more detailed view as to what's happening inside the kidney. Now, also, I have this image right here that you can see. Let me get that image for you real quick. So I have this image here that basically highlights the process of what I just mentioned. So it goes from the aorta, which is right, the blood exits your heart, goes to the aorta, the renal artery, the segmental artery, the interlobular, arcuate, cortical radiate artery, the afferent arteriole, the glomerulus, that capsule, and then the efferent arteriole, cortical radiate, arcuate, interlobular, renal, and then the inferior vena cava. Now, one thing that I need to mention real quick is that you'll notice that on the venous side, the blue side, there is no segmental artery. Whereas on the arterial side, there is a segmental artery. So that's basically the only difference that you have between the two. And then from the inferior vena cava, it goes back into the heart. In fact, let me show you how that. Okay, I don't have that image here. Let me go back so I can show you how the blood leaves the inferior vena cava and then makes its way back to the heart. So after the blood is processed, after it's filtered, it goes to the inferior vena cava, right, the renal artery, and then the inferior vena cava. And if you look inside, back up, this artery makes its way right back to the heart, right into the right atrium, right there. Let me zoom out a little bit. Okay, so if I had the rib cage removed here, in fact, let me see if I can do that real quick. Okay, so I removed the rib cage. So the inferior vena cava leading right back to the heart where it all kind of gets started all over again. Okay, so just to finish up the video, we're going to take a look at the urine that's actually produced and put into the urinary bladder. So 95% of urine is water, and the rest of it is a waste product. Okay, and then this waste product down here is shown in this test tube here. So about 2% is creatinine, ammonia, and uric acid, and about 2.8% is dissolved salts and other ions, and then 2% of it is urea. So this is all waste product that is in the urine, and there's a number of other things too, like bilirubin, for example. Bilirubin is also found in feces. You have dead red blood cells as well, which kind of gives the urine also like a more brightly yellow color. And as far as I've read, your urine should be, from it should be a light tint yellow. Not if it's a dark yellow, then that tells you that it's got way too much solutes dissolved in it, and you need more water. It's way too concentrated. Okay, so just briefly, I want to just quickly highlight what's going on again. So just to recap, you have the renal pelvises. Well, you have the renal cortex starting from the outside, right? And then you have the renal pyramids, right? The renal medulla. And then you have the renal pelvises, the ureters that lead down into the bladder. And then you have the urethra. And out the urethra, it exits the body at this point. Now, one more thing to mention about urine. Urine is sterile at this point. It becomes insterile once it exits the body, and then it's exposed to bacteria on the body, basically, or in the air. Okay, so I think that does it for this particular video. This was an introduction to the urinary system, just looking at the location, the general anatomy, and some of the basic functions of the urinary system. In future videos, we will get into more details as to the functions of the kidneys in particular. Okay, guys, thanks for watching, and good luck in your studying.